Hello everyone. Tonight, we are going to do something difficult. We are going to do something that might make you uncomfortable. We are going to turn our backs on the shining armor of knights and the golden crowns of kings. We are going to step away from the sunlight of history and descend into a darkness so absolute that for centuries we have pretended it didn't exist. We are going to explore the hidden world of medieval prisons. But not the prisons you see in movies, where a hero plots a daring escape. We are going to explore the prisons of silence, the prisons of the forgotten. We are going to look at the experience of women who were locked away in the Middle Ages. This is a story that has been buried under 600 years of stone and indifference. It is a story of biological horror that male prisoners never had to endure. It is a story of psychological torture so precise it shattered the mind before it even touched the body. We are going to talk about what happens when a body designed for life, for birth, for nurturing, is locked in a machine designed for death. Before we cross this threshold, I need to ask you something. If you believe that the voiceless deserve to be heard, if you have the stomach to face the unfiltered, raw reality of the past, please like this video and subscribe. It is a small gesture, but it helps us shine a light on the darkest corners of history. Now, take a deep breath. The air is about to get very heavy. Let's begin. To truly understand the horror of a medieval prison for a woman, we cannot just look at the architecture. We have to look at the society. We have to strip away everything we know about rights, about hygiene, about dignity. Imagine for a moment that you are a woman living in 14th century Europe. In this world, your identity does not belong to you. It is a borrowed thing. You are defined entirely by the men who stand between you and the world. You are someone's daughter. You are someone's wife. You are someone's mother. You are like a vine that needs a wall to climb. Without it, you are trampled in the dirt. Now, imagine that wall collapses. Maybe the plague takes your husband. Maybe poverty forces you into debt. Maybe a jealous neighbor whispers the word thief or witch to the wrong official. Suddenly, the protection is gone. You are arrested. And the moment the heavy oak door of the jail slams shut behind you, the moment that iron key turns with a sound like a gunshot in the lock, you have not just lost your freedom, you have lost your humanity. You have entered a state of social death. You are no longer a person. You are a thing to be stored in the dark until you rot or until you pay. The first thing that hits you isn't the fear. It is the sensory assault. It is the smell. It is a physical, living wall of stench that punches you in the gut. It is the smell of a cesspit that hasn't been emptied in 50 years. It is the smell of rotting straw, of stagnant black water, of unwashed bodies sweating in fear. And underneath it all, the sharp, metallic tang of old blood. It is the smell of misery. You stand there, blinking in the pitch blackness, and the cold starts to seep into your bones. Medieval dungeons were almost always subterranean. They were built into the deep foundations of castles, beneath the city gates, or in the hollowed-out crypts of cathedrals. This meant they were below the water table. The walls weep. The floors are slick with a mixture of mud, human waste, and slime. And here begins the first specific horror for a woman: the clothing. Let's look closely at what you are wearing. You are not a man wearing hose and a tunic that stops at the knee. You are wearing the required dress of a medieval woman. Layers of heavy linen and wool. A chemise next to your skin, a kirtle, and a heavy, dragging overdress. In the world above, These skirts are a sign of your modesty. They are your shield. In the dungeon, they are a death trap. Within the first hour of standing in that cell, the hem of your dress begins to soak up the filth from the floor. Wool is a wick. It draws the liquid up past your ankles, up to your calves, up to your knees. The fabric becomes heavy. It becomes freezing cold. And it becomes toxic. And here is the nightmare. It never dries. In a cell with no ventilation, no sunlight, and no fire, the humidity is absolute. You are trapped in a wet, rotting shell 24 hours a day. Imagine the sensation of that cold, abrasive wool, soaked in sewage, clinging to your legs. As you move, it rubs the skin raw. It creates ulcers, and through those open wounds, the bacteria from the floor enters your bloodstream. You start to shiver, not just from the cold, but from the fever. Your own clothes, the very things meant to protect your dignity, are slowly poisoning you. You try to hold your skirts up, carrying the heavy, wet fabric in your arms to keep it off your skin, but your arms grow tired. Eventually, exhaustion wins. You let the dress fall into the muck, and with that simple action, you surrender the first piece of your dignity. But the external dampness is nothing compared to the internal biological nightmare. We have to talk about the reality that history books are too polite to mention. We have to talk about the blood. In the medieval village, women had a community. They had methods to manage their monthly cycles: rags, moss, specially washed linens. They had access to the river or a basin of water. They had privacy. In the dungeon, you have nothing. No rags, no water, no privacy. When your cycle comes, you bleed. You bleed into the clothes that are already stiff with dirt. You have no way to clean yourself. You have no way to stop the flow. The blood dries, then wets again, becoming a hard crust that chafes and tears at the tender skin of your inner thighs. The smell of fresh blood mixes with the smell of old decay in the stagnant air of the cell. For a medieval woman, raised to believe that modesty was her soul's armor, this absolute biological exposure was a psychological torture worse than the rack. It reduced her to an animal state. The shame burned hotter than the cold. You curl up in the corner, trying to hide yourself, but there is nowhere to hide. You are betrayed by your own biology. And then, the blood attracts the visitors. Rats. Not the mice you see in a field. These are dungeon rats, bold, large, and starving. They live in the walls. They scuttle through the straw, and they have a keen sense of smell. They are attracted to the scent of blood. Imagine trying to sleep, exhausted, leaning against the cold stone. And then you feel it. The scratch of claws on your ankle. The weight of a small, heavy body climbing up the folds of your skirt. You can't see them in the pitch black. You can only hear the chittering. You can only feel the whiskers. You kick out, screaming, but you hear a dozen more in the corners. The psychological terror of knowing you are being hunted as food while you are still alive. It is enough to shatter the mind long before the starvation kills the body. You pull your knees to your chest, wrapping your arms around yourself, making yourself as small as possible. But you cannot disappear. You are trapped in your own skin. But the rats were not the most dangerous predators in the dark. The most dangerous predator walked on two legs and carried a ring of iron keys. We need to talk about the jailer. In movies, the jailer is a background character. In reality, he was the god of this small, hellish world. These men were not professional officers. They were mercenaries, executioners' assistants, men who lived on the fringe of society, willing to work in the dark for a pittance. They were unsupervised. They were unmonitored. The relationship between the male jailer and the female prisoner is the darkest chapter of this story. When that heavy door creaked open, allowing a sliver of torchlight to cut the darkness, the woman inside knew she was entirely at his mercy. There were no witnesses. If she screamed, the stone walls swallowed the sound. If she tried to report him, who would believe her? She was a criminal. She was a fallen woman. Her word was dust. Sexual violence in medieval prisons was not an anomaly. It was a systemic feature. It was the unspoken tax of incarceration. This threat created a specific form of psychological torture that men did not face: hypervigilance. You could never truly sleep. You lay there in the dark, straining your ears. Is that a footstep? Is that the jingle of keys? Is he coming to this cell? Or the next one? You listen to the breathing of the man standing in the doorway, trying to gauge his mood, his sobriety, his intent. Your body is flooded with cortisol. Your heart beats so hard it hurts your ribs. This state of constant fight or flight, sustained for weeks or months, chemically destroys the brain. Many women went mad in these dungeons, not because of the isolation, but because of the terror of the anticipation. The waiting was worse than the act itself. And sometimes the danger wasn't even the jailer. Because prisons were often overcrowded and unregulated, segregation between men and women was an ideal, not a reality. In local town jails, everyone, thieves, murderers, debtors, men and women, might be thrown into a single common ward. The common ward was a pit of humanity. Dark, crowded, violent. A woman thrown into a mixed common ward was like a lamb thrown into a wolf's den. The social contract evaporated. It was the law of the jungle. Her safety depended entirely on her ability to bribe, or, tragically, her submission to the strongest man in the room for protection against the others. It was a descent into a primal hell, where you had to become a monster to survive the monsters. But there is a specific kind of horror reserved for a specific kind of woman: the mother. We must look at the intersection of life and death, pregnancy and prison. It was not uncommon for women to be pregnant when arrested, or to become pregnant while imprisoned due to the systemic assault we just discussed. In medieval law, this condition created a strange, heartbreaking legal loophole known as pleading the belly. The law stated that the state could not execute an innocent unborn child. So, if a condemned woman could prove she was pregnant, her execution would be stayed until the baby was born. Think of the horror of that mercy. The pregnancy became the most valuable thing in the world. It was a shield against the hangman. Women would pray to be pregnant. They would beg the jury of matrons, a group of older women sent to examine them, to find a heartbeat. If confirmed, she was granted a reprieve. She was given 9 months. But what kind of 9 months? She is growing a life inside a tomb. She is malnourished, surviving on prison bread, a coarse mixture of rye, barley, and sometimes sawdust, and water that might be scooped from a stagnant cistern. Her body is starving. It begins to cannibalize itself to feed the fetus. Her bones ache as the calcium is leached away to build the skeleton of the child. She is breathing air thick with smoke and disease. She is terrified that the sickness of the prison will kill the baby, and by extension kill her. And then, labor begins. There are no midwives with hot water. There are no clean sheets. She labors on a bed of filthy, lice-infested straw in the absolute dark. The pain is excruciating. The risk of infection, puerperal fever, is astronomical. She has to cut the cord with her own teeth. She has to clean the baby with her own saliva because there is no water. And then she holds the child. A baby born in a dungeon. Its first breath is the damp, moldy air of the crypt. Its first sight is the gray stone. She nurses it, loving it with a fierceness born of desperation. But every time she looks at that child, her heart breaks, because the baby is her death sentence. The moment the child is born, the clock starts ticking again. Once the baby is weaned or handed over to the parish, the executioner is summoned. She is raising her child knowing that its growth is the countdown to her own end. Archaeology confirms this tragedy. Under the foundations of old prisons, we find the bones. Skeletons of women with pelvic deformities from traumatic births. Skeletons of infants buried alongside them in the unconsecrated ground. In rare, heartbreaking cases, archaeologists have found the phenomenon of coffin birth, where the gases of decomposition expelled the fetus after the mother had died. They lie there together in the dark, eternal witnesses to a system that had no mercy. This was the physical reality. This was the battle of the body against the stone. But the medieval world was not just a world of matter. It was a world of the spirit. And there were prisons designed not to rot the body, but to break the mind. We have not yet spoken of the witches. We have not yet spoken of the nuns walled up alive. We have spoken of the body. We have witnessed how the stone walls, the damp wool, and the biological vulnerability of women were weaponized to destroy the flesh. But the medieval world was not just a world of matter. It was a world of the spirit. And there were prisons designed not to rot the body, but to break the mind. We cannot tell the story of the female prisoner without entering the laboratories of psychological destruction that were built specifically for her. By the late medieval and early modern period, the fear of the unruly woman, the woman who spoke too freely, who knew too much, or who refused to submit, had morphed into something far more dangerous: the terror of the witch. The prisons built for these women were not just holding pens. They were machines designed to dismantle the human will. The inquisitors didn't just want to kill the body. They wanted to colonize the mind. They needed a confession. They needed the woman to say the words, "I am a witch," to validate their own fears. To get this, they used a technique that left no marks, no broken bones, and no blood, but destroyed the soul more effectively than the rack ever could. They used sleep deprivation. They called it walking or watching. It sounds almost benign, doesn't it? Like a vigil. But it was one of the most sophisticated and effective torture methods ever devised. A woman accused of witchcraft would be stripped, shaved to find devil's marks, and placed in a cell. Guards were stationed in the room with strict orders. Never let her close her eyes. If she nodded off, they would shout. If she collapsed, they would shake her. If she couldn't stand, they would drag her up and force her to walk. Back and forth, mile after mile in a small cell, hour after hour, day after day. They claimed this was to stop her familiar, a demon in the shape of a mouse, a cat, or a bird, from visiting her in her sleep to renew her powers. In reality, they were inducing acute psychosis. We know today that after 72 hours without sleep, the human brain fractures. The boundaries between thought and reality dissolve. Hallucinations begin. Imagine you are that woman. You haven't slept in 3 days. Your legs are numb. Your eyes feel like they are filled with sand. The stone walls of the cell begin to breathe. The flickering torchlight becomes hellfire. The guard's face looks like a demon. You begin to hear voices, whispers in the corner of the room. You lose the ability to distinguish between what you did and what you dreamt. You lose the ability to distinguish between memory and suggestion. In this state of delirium, terrified and broken, her mind shattered into fragments, she would confess to anything. The Inquisitor asks, "Did you kiss the devil?" In her hallucination, she sees the devil. She says, "Yes." He asks, "Did you fly on a broomstick?" She feels the floor dropping away. She says yes. He asks, "Is your neighbor a witch?" She says yes. She would say anything just to make the walking stop, just to be allowed to close her eyes. The prison, in this case, was a factory for manufacturing guilt, grinding a human being down until she was nothing but a puppet reciting her own death warrant. The tragedy is that history recorded these confessions as truth, rather than the delirious ramblings of tortured women. We read the court transcripts today and see proof of witchcraft, when we should be seeing proof of mental collapse. But the attempt to control women didn't always require a charge of witchcraft. Sometimes, the crime was simply speaking. We must talk about the instruments designed to enforce silence. In medieval law, a man might be punished for what he did: stealing, fighting, killing. A woman was often punished for what she said, for being unruly, for scolding, for nagging, for stepping outside the narrow boundaries of submissive behavior. The prison was the ultimate silencer, but there were specific devices designed to amplify this message. The scold's bridle was one such horror. It was an iron cage that fitted over the head, a heavy mask of metal. Inside, a metal plate, sometimes spiked, was inserted into the mouth to press down the tongue. Imagine the sensation: the taste of cold, rusted iron, the inability to swallow, the inability to speak. A woman wearing this could only drool and grunt. She would be chained in the market square, or led through the streets, a public spectacle of humiliation. While not always a feature of long-term imprisonment, the bridle represents the philosophy of the dungeon. The goal was to take away the woman's voice, to reduce her to an object, to make her safe for society by removing her ability to challenge it. As terrible as the secular dungeon was, there was another kind of prison. A prison that claimed to be kind, a prison that claimed to be saving you. We must now steel ourselves to enter the prisons of the church. If the king's prison was hell, the church's prison was a special kind of purgatory. In the medieval ecclesiastical mind, sin was a disease, and imprisonment was the cure. For a woman who had broken her vows, a nun who had lost her chastity, or a woman accused of profound heresy, the church offered a specific, chilling remedy. It was called vade in pace. In Latin it means, go in peace. It sounds gentle, doesn't it? It sounds like a blessing. But in the context of medieval monastic law, it was a sentence of living death. This was the practice of permanent solitary confinement, sometimes literally within the walls of the convent or abbey. Imagine the ritual. This wasn't a chaotic arrest by armed guards. It was a liturgical ceremony. The accused nun would be brought into the chapel. Her sisters would gather, holding candles, their faces hidden behind veils. The priest would chant the office of the dead, the prayers usually reserved for a funeral. They would read the Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath. The woman stood there, breathing, her heart beating, listening to her own funeral mass. She was being declared dead to the world while she was still standing in it. After the prayers, she would be led to a small cell. Sometimes this cell was in a basement, sometimes deep in the crypt, and in the most extreme, documented cases, It was a niche carved into the thick stone foundation of the building itself. She would step inside. She might have a small loaf of bread and a pitcher of water. And then, the mason would step forward. Brick by brick, the opening would be sealed. Imagine standing on the other side of that wall, watching the last slice of light narrow and then vanish, hearing the scrape of the trowel, the wet slap of mortar. And then, silence. The "go in peace" was a sentence to wait for death in total darkness, a few feet away from the women you had lived and prayed with. There are accounts of women surviving for years in these conditions, fed through a small slit or a squint in the wall. The psychological horror is almost impossible to grasp. To hear the muffled sounds of the choir singing the morning office, to smell the incense, to know that life is continuing just on the other side of the stone while you rot in a coffin that you cannot lie down in. This was the church's mercy. By destroying the body, they believed they were purifying the soul. They believed that in the darkness, stripped of all sensory input, the sinner would be forced to confront God. But more often, they confronted madness. But the church's involvement with female imprisonment went beyond the dramatic horror of the walled-up nun. We must look at the precursors to the Magdalene laundries, the medieval penance houses for fallen women. In the medieval worldview, female sexuality was viewed as dangerous, chaotic, and in need of strict containment. Women who were prostitutes, unmarried and pregnant, or even victims of rape who were blamed for their own assault, were often locked away in these institutions. Unlike the idle darkness of the secular dungeon where you simply waited, these were places of forced labor. The logic was that idleness led to sin, so exhaustion must lead to redemption. The women here were not just prisoners. They were slaves to a theology of shame. They were forced to work from before dawn until after dark, spinning wool, weaving, scrubbing floors, washing clothes. This was a different kind of prison. It was a prison of drudgery. The torture here wasn't the rack. It was the repetitive, back-breaking motion of the loom or the scrub brush performed in absolute silence, day after day, year after year. The goal was to scrub the sin away, to break the woman's spirit so completely that she became a vessel of obedience. And because these institutions were framed as charities, as places of refuge, saving these women from the streets, the cruelty was masked by a veneer of holiness. The public saw a house of God. The women inside saw a labor camp where they were enslaved by their own biology and the moral judgment of men. We must also consider the women who were imprisoned not for crimes, but for madness. In the medieval world, mental illness in women was often interpreted as possession or as a moral failing. The concept of hysteria, derived from the Greek word for uterus, was already taking root. A woman who screamed, who tore her clothes, who fell into fits of depression, was a problem to be hidden away. These women were often chained in the cellars of hospitals or almshouses. They were treated worse than animals. They were often kept naked, sleeping on straw that was rarely changed, their food thrown to them like dogs. The treatment for their condition was often brutality, shocking them with cold water, beating the demons out of them, or keeping them in total darkness to soothe their minds. The tragic irony is that the conditions of their confinement often exacerbated their illness. A woman suffering from postpartum depression, locked in a dark cellar and separated from her child, would almost certainly descend into full-blown psychosis. The prison created the monster it claimed to contain. And yet, in the midst of this total system of oppression, physical, biological, psychological, spiritual, there were moments of resistance. There were cracks in the stone. We cannot tell the story of the female prisoner without telling the story of the female escape artist. Escaping a medieval dungeon was nearly impossible physically. You couldn't dig through 6 feet of granite with a spoon, especially when you were malnourished. You couldn't overpower a guard who was twice your size and armed with a sword. So, women had to use the only weapons left to them: their wits, their deception, and the very underestimation that put them there. Take the case of Alice Keitler, the first person condemned for witchcraft in Ireland in 1324. Alice was not a peasant. She was a wealthy merchant, a woman of power who had outlived 4 husbands. The Bishop of Ossory was determined to burn her. He accused her of poisoning her husbands, of sacrificing animals to demons, of heading a coven. The dungeon was waiting. But Alice had something most female prisoners didn't. She had money, and she understood the political rivalries of men. While detained, she didn't cower. She manipulated the connections she had. She used her wealth to bribe, and her influence to turn the local lords against the bishop. And just before the trap could snap shut, Alice Keitler vanished. She escaped to England, disappearing from the pages of history, never to be caught. It was a triumph of cunning. But every escape has a cost, and this story reveals a brutal truth about the intersection of gender and class. Alice escaped, but someone had to burn to satisfy the bishop's rage. That someone was Petronilla de Meath, Alice's maid. Petronilla didn't have gold. She didn't have powerful friends. She was tortured, flogged 6 times publicly, and eventually burned at the stake in Alice's place. The first woman in Ireland to be burned for heresy was not the witch herself, but the servant she left behind. This reminds us that the sisterhood of the oppressed had its limits. When the fire was lit, class was the ultimate shield. There were other, more desperate methods of escape. Folklore and fragmented records tell us of women who manipulated the gender dynamics of their jailers. These weren't romance stories. They were tactical operations. Women who realized that their jailers viewed them as weak, as fragile, or as sexual objects, and used that perception as a weapon. Feigning illness to draw a guard close, playing the role of the helpless, fainting damsel to lower a man's guard before striking him with a rock or a chain. Or, in the darkest scenarios, trading the only thing they had left, their bodies, for a moment of freedom or a blind eye turned at the right moment. These women weaponized the very stereotypes used to oppress them. They turned their weakness into a disguise for a blade. And then there were those who escaped through the mind. When the body is trapped, the imagination becomes the only landscape of freedom. We have accounts of female mystics imprisoned for heresy who reported visions of God, of angels, of golden cities. Were these hallucinations brought on by starvation and darkness, or were they genuine spiritual experiences? In a way, it doesn't matter. For the woman in the cell, the vision was real. It was a way to transcend the stone walls. It was a way to assert that although her body belonged to the jailer, her soul belonged to something greater. This spiritual resistance was a powerful tool of survival, allowing women to endure conditions that should have killed them. But these escapes were rare. For most, the story ended in the dark. But for every Alice Keitler who escaped into the mist, for every mystic who transcended her cell through visions of the divine, there were thousands who did not. For the vast majority of women, the story did not end with a dramatic flight into the night or a spiritual epiphany. It ended in the quiet, crushing reality of the earth. We must now turn our eyes from the stone walls to the ground beneath our feet. We must leave the realm of written records, which were often burned or sanitized by those in power, and enter the realm of the physical truth. Because while the manuscripts might be silent and the jailer's logs might be empty, the earth remembers. We are now entering the age of forensics. When we peel back the layers of history, removing the cobblestones of modern cities and the foundations of Victorian warehouses, we find the medieval strata. And in that dark, compressed soil, we find the bones. The skeletons of female prisoners tell a story that ink on parchment never could. They are the black box recorders of a life lived in hell, preserving the truth of their suffering in the very chemistry of their remains. Bioarchaeologists excavating sites near known medieval prisons, like the area surrounding the Clink in London or the forgotten burial grounds near the dungeons of castles in France, have found remains that bear the specific, undeniable signatures of incarceration. When these scientists analyze the skeletons of women found in these unconsecrated grounds, they are reading a biography of trauma. We see skeletons of women in their 20s with the bone density of 80-year-olds. This is the mark of a life lived without sunlight. Years of total darkness deprive them of vitamin D, stopping the body from absorbing calcium. At the same time, starvation forced their bodies to cannibalize their own skeletons to keep their hearts beating. Their bones became as brittle as dry twigs, snapping under the slightest pressure. We see evidence of rickets and osteomalacia, softening of the bones, that would have made every movement, every step across the cell floor, an agonizing ordeal. But the bones tell us of violence, too. We find healed fractures on the ulna, the forearm bone. In forensic science, these are known as parry-fractures. They do not occur from falls or accidents. They occur when a person raises their arm to block a blow directed at the head or face. Finding these fractures on the skeletons of female prisoners is the physical proof of the systemic violence we spoke of earlier. These women lived their final years cowering, raising their arms to protect themselves from the anger of guards or the violence of the common ward. The bone healed, often crookedly without a splint, locking the memory of that assault into the skeleton forever. We find ribs that were broken and rebroken. We find skulls with healed trauma consistent with being struck by heavy objects. These women carried the map of their torture within their own bodies, long after the bruises had faded from the skin. And most hauntingly, we find the evidence of the mothers. This is perhaps the hardest truth to look at, but we must not look away. We find pelvic bones that are scarred and pitted, signs of traumatic, unassisted births where the body was torn apart. We find the tiny, fragile remains of infants. Sometimes they are buried carefully, perhaps wrapped in a scrap of cloth that has long since disintegrated, placed by a grieving mother's hand in a shallow grave dug into the prison floor. But sometimes they are found in positions of chaos, thrown into the mass grave with the mother, rejected by the consecrated ground of the churchyard. In a few rare, heartbreaking cases, archaeologists have discovered the phenomenon of coffin birth, or post-mortem fetal extrusion, where the gases of decomposition expelled the fetus after the mother had already died of plague or starvation. They lie together in the dark, an eternal testament to a system that offered no mercy to the innocent, entwined in a final embrace that death itself could not sever. These bones are not just calcium and phosphate. They are the physical remains of suffering. They are the tangible proof that the horror was not folklore. It was real. It happened. And it happened to real people who felt pain, fear, and love just as acutely as we do. They were not characters in a story. They were flesh and blood, abandoned by their world, waiting for us to find them. But what of the survivors? What of the women who served their time, paid their fines, or were finally released by a merciful judge? We might assume that for them, the nightmare was over. We might assume that the moment the heavy door opened and they squinted into the blinding sunlight, there was a happy ending. But we would be wrong. The prison did not end at the gate. We must talk about the aftermath. We must talk about the ghost life. In the medieval world, reputation was the only currency a woman had. It was more valuable than gold. A man could be a rogue, a thief, or a drunkard, and still find work as a laborer or a soldier. He could redeem himself through strength or skill. But a woman's value was tied entirely to her purity and her obedience. The moment the prison door closed behind her, that value was destroyed. When a woman walked out of a medieval prison, she did not walk back into her life. She walked into a void. She was damaged goods. She was marked. The smell of the dungeon seemed to cling to her skin, invisible but undeniable. Her neighbors would cross the street to avoid her, fearing that her bad luck or her immorality was contagious. Her family, shamed by her imprisonment, might refuse to take her back. A husband might have declared her dead or taken a mistress in her absence, leaving her with no legal standing in her own home. She was unmarriageable. She was unemployable. Who would hire a servant who had been in the jail? Who would trust a wet nurse who had lived with rats? Who would buy bread from a woman who had been branded a scold? Many women survived the starvation and the cold of the dungeon, only to die of exposure on the streets within weeks of their release. They were forced into begging or prostitution, the very crimes that might have put them in prison in the first place. It was a vicious, inescapable cycle. The prison created a class of women who had no place in the daylight world. They became the ghosts of the city, haunting the alleyways, sleeping in church porches, invisible to the society that had rejected them. They had survived the stone walls, only to be crushed by the invisible walls of social stigma. And even if they found a way to survive physically, the psychological scars never faded. We don't have medieval medical records for post-traumatic stress disorder, but we have the stories. We have the folklore. We have accounts of women who could never sleep in the dark again, who kept candles burning until they melted into wax pools. Women who would scream at the sound of a jingling key or the heavy tread of boots. Women who fell silent and never spoke another word for the rest of their lives, their voices left behind in the cell. The dungeon had colonized their minds. They might have been physically free, walking under the open sky, but in their dreams, they were still back in the cell, listening to the dripping water, waiting for the footsteps of the jailer. They carried the prison inside them until the day they died. This trauma was often generational. The children of these women, if they survived, grew up in the shadow of their mother's shame. They inherited the poverty and the social exclusion. The prison didn't just destroy one life. It poisoned the roots of an entire family tree, creating a lineage of the marginalized that persisted for centuries. As we stand here at the end of our journey, looking back at the long, dark corridor of history, we have to ask ourselves a difficult question. Why does this matter? Why should we care about the suffering of women who died 600 years ago? Why should we disturb their rest to tell these horrific stories? We should care because the story didn't end in the Middle Ages. The systems we have explored tonight, the policing of female sexuality, the pathologizing of female emotion, the use of shame as a weapon of control, did not vanish with the invention of the printing press or the steam engine. They evolved. They changed their names, but they kept their shape. They learned to hide in plain sight. The hysteria diagnosis of the medieval dungeon, which claimed a woman's uterus made her mad, evolved directly into the Victorian asylum. In those massive brick institutions, Women were locked away for nervous disorders that were often nothing more than a desire for independence, a refusal to marry, or grief over a lost child. They were silenced with laudanum instead of iron bridles, but the intent was the same: to remove the unruly woman from society. The penance houses where medieval women scrubbed floors to wash away their sins evolved into the Magdalen laundries of the 20th century. These institutions, run by the church and supported by the state, operated in Ireland until 1996. That is not ancient history. That is living memory. In those laundries, women were stripped of their names, forced into unpaid labor, and buried in unmarked graves, just like their medieval sisters. They were imprisoned not for crimes, but for being pregnant out of wedlock, for being too pretty, or for being victims of abuse. The logic of the medieval dungeon, that a woman's sexuality is a danger that must be contained, survived well into the modern era. The echoes of the scold's bridle are still heard every time a woman is told she is too loud, too emotional, or too aggressive when she speaks truth to power. The shadow of the witch trials still falls over us every time a powerful woman is demonized or accused of being unnatural. The fear of the unruly woman is a current that runs deep beneath the foundations of our own society. We study the medieval prison not to comfort ourselves with how far we have come, but to recognize the patterns that persist. We study it to see the machinery of oppression naked, stripped of its modern disguises. The hidden world of medieval prisons was a crucible. It burned away the flesh, but it left behind a truth that we are only now beginning to articulate. The women in those dungeons were not just victims of their time. They were casualties of a war on female autonomy. But they were also warriors. We must recognize their resistance. Every woman who whispered a prayer in the dark to keep her sanity was fighting back against the silence. Every mother who shielded her child from the cold with her own rotting clothes was engaging in an act of rebellion against a system that wanted them both dead. Every witch who refused to name her sisters despite the pain of the walking torture was a hero. We cannot save them. We cannot go back and unlock the doors. We cannot pass a cup of water through the bars or hold their hands in the dark. We cannot undo the pain. But we can do the one thing the system tried to prevent. We can remember them. We can refuse to let them be erased. We can look at the darkness of history and refuse to look away. We can speak their names when we know them: Anne, Mary, Alice, Petronilla. And we can honor their silence when we don't. We can acknowledge that the ground we walk on holds their stories. History is usually written by the victors. It is written by the men who held the keys. But tonight, we have tried to read the history written by the prisoners. It is a history written in scratches on the wall, in broken bones, and in the defiant survival of the human spirit. So, the next time you see a castle on a hill, don't just admire the towers reaching for the sky. Think about the foundations. Think about the dark, damp spaces beneath the earth. Picture the woman in the corner. Picture the mother holding a silent infant. Picture the girl who refused to be broken even when the world buried her alive. They are the true ghosts of the Middle Ages. They are the silence in the stone. And it is time their story was told. Thank you for walking this dark path with me tonight. I know this was not an easy journey. It is heavy, and it hurts. But history isn't supposed to be comfortable. It is supposed to be true. If you believe that these voices deserve to be heard, please hit that like button. It helps this video reach more people. breaking the silence that has held these women for centuries. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring the hidden, unfiltered history of our world. And I want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell me, which part of this reality shocked you the most? Was it the biological nightmare, the betrayal of the church, or the resilience of the survivors? And do you see the echoes of these systems in our world today? I read every single comment, and I want to know what you think. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and remember, the light of history is only as bright as the shadows we are willing to explore. Good night.